Miles Parker stood at the edge of the dilapidated barn, his weathered hands gripping a hammer as tightly as he clutched the small hope that had brought him to Oakridge Valley. The autumn wind whistled through the gaps in the worn wooden planks, whispering secrets of a structure that had once stood proud against the changing seasons. Now, like Miles himself, it seemed to be hanging on by sheer determination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. So, you fix things without asking too many questions, Mr. Parker. The voice behind him was gentle, but carried an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite place. Caution, perhaps, or a carefully guarded vulnerability. Miles turned to face Eleanor Hayes, the woman who had hired him with nothing more than a phone call and the promise of fair pay. Her silver-streaked chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical bun, her eyes the color of the forest after rainfall. She stood with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered her own storms. "When the bills need paying, I don't have the luxury of curiosity," Miles replied, the corner of his mouth lifting in what passed for a smile these days. But perhaps he should have asked questions. Perhaps he should have wondered why a woman, who dressed in simple work clothes, drove a truck that was 15 years old, would hire a stranger to repair a barn that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. But Miles Parker had learned the hard way that looking too far ahead, or behind, only made the present harder to bear. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of sneakers pounding against dirt drew their attention. 10-year-old Noah Parker raced around the corner of the barn, his sandy brown hair flying wild in the wind, eyes bright with the boundless hope that only children seem capable of maintaining. "Dad! Dad! This place is huge!" Noah skidded to a stop, sending a small cloud of dust billowing around his worn jeans. "There's a creek behind those trees, and I think I saw a fox. A real, live fox." His excitement was contagious, making even Eleanor's reserved expression soften into something warmer. "Is that so?" Miles ruffled his son's hair, grateful for the momentary distraction. "Just remember to stay where I can see you, all right? We're guests here." "You and your son can explore the property," Eleanor offered unexpectedly. "The creek's safe enough if he stays in the shallow parts." Miles studied her, trying to read the story behind her words. "That's generous of you," Eleanor shrugged, her gaze drifting to the expanse of land that stretched beyond the barn. "There's no point in having space if no one enjoys it." It was a curious thing to say, Miles thought, the kind of statement that raised more questions than it answered. But Noah was already bouncing on his heels, ready to dash off again, and there was work to be done. Questions would have to wait. "Go on then," Miles told his son with a nod. "But be back before the sun starts setting, you hear?" Noah was off like a shot, his whoop of delight echoing across the valley. Miles watched him go, his chest tight, with a familiar mixture of love and worry. 3 years of raising Noah alone had taught him that parenthood was just that, an endless dance between joy and fear. "Your son has a lot of energy," Eleanor observed, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Enough to power a small town," Miles agreed. "Been that way since he could crawl." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Noah disappeared into the distance before Eleanor gestured to the barn. "It's been in my family for generations," she said, her voice taking on a reverent quality. "My grandfather built it with his own hands during the Depression, said as long as you could build something, you weren't truly poor." Miles ran his hand along one of the support beams, feeling the history ingrained in the wood. "Your grandfather knew what he was doing. The foundation's still strong. It's mainly the roof and some of these outer panels that need attention." He tapped the beam with his knuckles. "Good bones. That counts for a lot." Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes. Appreciation, perhaps, or recognition. Not many people notice that anymore. Miles didn't respond immediately. He'd spent the last decade of his life restoring buildings that others had given up on. There was a certain satisfaction in bringing something back from the brink, in proving that damage didn't have to mean destruction. Sometimes he wondered if he was trying to fix himself through every broken door, every cracked foundation, every sagging roof. "I'll need to get up there and take a closer look at the roof first," he said. "All business now. See how much needs. Replacing before winter hits." Eleanor nodded. "All business herself. Whatever you need, just let me know. I don't mind getting my hands dirty." Miles raised an eyebrow. "Most property owners I've worked for prefer to keep their distance." "I've never been most people, Mr. Parker." There was a hint of steel beneath her mild tone. "Just Miles is fine," he offered, surprising himself. He usually kept his clients at arm's length, professional boundaries firmly in place. But there was something about Eleanor Hayes that made formality feel unnecessary, perhaps even impossible. "Eleanor, then," she countered, extending her hand. He took it, noticing the calluses that matched his own. Working hands, honest hands. It was a small detail, but it shifted something in his perception of her. "I'll help wherever I can," she continued. "I used to help my father with repairs around the property. I'm not just here to supervise." Miles found himself smiling, a genuine one this time. "Fair enough. We'll start tomorrow at first light, if that works for you." Eleanor nodded once, decisive. "I'll have coffee ready." As she walked back toward the modest farmhouse in the distance, Miles found himself watching her go, struck by the contradictions she presented. She owned all this land, yet there was nothing pretentious about. She could easily hire a professional crew to rebuild the entire barn, yet she'd called him a traveling handyman with not much more than a rusty pickup and a toolbox to his name. Miles shook his head, turning his attention back to the barn. The mysteries of Eleanor Hayes weren't his concern. He was here to do a job, collect his pay, and move on to the next town, the next temporary home, the next step in the endless journey that his life had become since Karen's death. The old cabin Miles and Noah had rented on the outskirts of Oakridge Valley was little more than a glorified hunting lodge, but it was clean and dry, and after 3 months of cramped motel rooms, it felt almost luxurious. The owner, a gruff man named Jim Halloran, had offered it at a surprisingly reasonable rate when he'd heard Miles was in town for work. "Not much use to anyone during hunting off-season," Jim had explained with a shrug. "Might as well have someone in it." That night, as Noah slept peacefully in the small bedroom, Miles sat on the cabin's porch, nursing a cup of black coffee and staring at the star-filled sky. Oakridge Valley was far enough from any major city that the night was untainted by artificial light, the Milky Way, a brilliant smear across the heavens. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through job listings in neighboring counties. The barn repair for Eleanor would take a few weeks at most, and then they'd need somewhere new to go. That was the pattern they'd fallen into over the past 3 years. Arrive, work, leave. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Never staying long enough to form attachments, never lingering long enough for the grief to catch up completely. His thumb hovered over a listing for a renovation job in Claiborne, about 2 hours north. It would be available after he finished. With Eleanor's barn, perfect timing. He should apply now, secure their next destination. Instead, he found himself closing the browser and opening his photo gallery. He scrolled back 3 years to the last photos of Karen. Her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, her smile bright as she hugged Noah, then 7 years old. Both of them covered in flour from a baking project gone chaotic. The next photo showed her looking over her shoulder at Miles, one eyebrow raised, a laugh caught halfway on her lips. 3 days later, she was gone. A rainy night, a truck driver who fell asleep at the wheel, A collision that happened so fast, she never felt a thing. Or so the doctors had assured him, as if that could somehow stem the tide of his grief. Miles closed the photos, his throat tight. 3 years, and it still felt like yesterday. He had promised himself he would be strong, for Noah would build them a new life, would find a way through the darkness. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this, the magnitude of what they'd lost threatened to overwhelm him. A sound from inside the cabin pulled him from his thoughts. Noah was calling out in his sleep, not a nightmare, just the mumbling of a child lost in dreams. Miles stood stretching his stiff muscles and went inside. He paused at Noah's bedside, gently brushing the hair from his son's forehead. Noah settled immediately, his breathing deep and even. "We're going to be okay, buddy," Miles whispered, though whether he was reassuring his son or himself was hard to say. One day at a time. Tomorrow, they would begin work on Eleanor's barn. It was just another job, just another temporary stop in their journey. Miles told himself this as he crawled into his own bed, trying to ignore the strange feeling that Oakridge Valley might be different from all the places that had come before. Dawn broke over the valley in streaks of amber and rose, painting the landscape in a golden glow that made even the dilapidated barn look somehow dignified. Miles and Noah arrived as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern hills, the old pickup truck groaning in protest as it navigated the uneven driveway leading to Eleanor's farm. Eleanor was already outside, 2 mugs of steaming coffee in her hands. She wore a flannel shirt over faded jeans, her hair pulled back in the same practical style as the day before. Something about seeing her there, framed by the morning light, made Miles pause. There was a steadiness to her presence that felt almost like gravity, a natural force, pulling everything around her into orbit. "Right on time," she greeted them, extending one of the mugs to Miles. "Black, right?" Miles accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, surprised she'd remembered his preference from their brief conversation the day before. "You didn't have to get up this early." Eleanor's smile was slight, but genuine. "Early is when the world makes the most sense." She glanced at Noah, who was fighting back a yawn. "There's hot chocolate on the kitchen counter if you'd like some." Noah's eyes widened, fatigue forgotten. He looked to Miles for permission. "Go ahead," Miles said. "Just mind your manners." As Noah darted toward the house, Eleanor chuckled. "He reminds me of my nephew at that age. Endless energy, once properly fueled." "You have family nearby?" Miles asked, taking a sip of the coffee. It was rich and strong, exactly how he liked it. A shadow passed across Eleanor's face. "Not anymore. My sister and her husband moved to Arizona years ago. Health reasons." There was more to that story. Miles sensed, but he didn't press. Everyone had their private burdens. He knew that better than most. Instead, he turned his attention to the barn, assessing the day's work ahead. "I'll start with the roof. Need to see how much of the supporting structure is still sound." Eleanor nodded, setting her coffee aside. "I've got some extra lumber in the old storage shed. It's not much, but it might save you a trip to town." They worked together through the morning, falling into an easy rhythm. Eleanor was true to her word. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. She helped Miles haul lumber, held the ladder steady as he climbed onto the roof, and seemed to anticipate what tools he needed before he asked for them. Noah, after finishing his hot chocolate, had wandered off to explore the creek again, with strict instructions to stay within shouting distance. Every now and then, his excited voice would carry back to them, announcing some new discovery. "Dad, I found a frog! It's green with these cool spots." Miles smiled, hammering down a loose shingle. "That's great, buddy." Eleanor, who was handing him nails from the ground, looked toward the creek. "The wildlife here has always been abundant. When I was a girl, my father would take me fishing in that creek. We'd catch brook trout for dinner." "You grew up here," Then, Miles asked, reaching down for another handful of nails. Born and raised, Eleanor confirmed, 4th generation on this land. There was a pride in her voice, but also something heavier. Responsibility, perhaps, or the weight of history. Miles understood that kind of weight. It was different from the burden of grief he carried, but familiar nonetheless. The pressure of living up to something, of preserving what came before. By midday, the sun was high and hot, and they took a break in the shade of a massive oak tree near the barn. Eleanor had packed a simple lunch, sandwiches, apples and bottles of water, which they shared on a weathered picnic table. Noah, who had reluctantly been called back from his explorations, devoured his sandwich in record time. "This place is awesome," he declared, mouth still half full. "We should stay here forever." Miles shot him a warning look. "Manners, Noah. And we go where the work is. You know that." Eleanor watched the exchange with quiet interest. "How long have you been traveling for work, Miles?" "About 3 years now," he answered, keeping his tone casual, "since Noah was 7. "That's a long time to be on the move," she observed, no judgment in her voice, just gentle curiosity. Miles shrugged, unwilling to delve into the reasons. "It suits us, right, buddy?" Noah, who had been about to protest, caught his father's expression and nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, I guess, but this place is still the coolest." A comfortable silence fell over them as they finished their lunch. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily in the thermals, its cry echoing across the valley. Miles found himself wondering what it would be like to stay in one place again, to wake up to the same view every morning, to watch the seasons change across the same landscape. It was a dangerous thought, one he quickly pushed aside. Attachment meant vulnerability, and he'd learned the hard way how quickly everything could be taken away. After lunch, as they prepared to return to work, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. A sleek black SUV was making its way up the driveway, looking distinctly out of place against the rustic backdrop of the farm. Eleanor's expression shifted, the openness of moments before replaced by a guarded wariness. "I wasn't expecting anyone," she said, more to herself than to Miles. The SUV came to a stop near the farmhouse, and a man in his early 50s stepped out. He was expensively dressed in a tailored suit that seemed ludicrously formal for the setting, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile practiced and cold. "Eleanor," he called, striding toward them with confident purpose. "I was beginning to think you were avoiding my calls." "I was," Eleanor replied bluntly. "Hello, Richard." "Ooh." Richard's smile didn't falter, though his eyes hardened slightly at her tone. He glanced at Miles and Noah, his gaze dismissive. "I see you're having some work done. Finally considering my offer." Eleanor crossed her arms. "Not even slightly." The Miles, sensing the tension, cleared his throat. "Noah, why don't you go check on that frog you found earlier?" Noah, who had been watching the exchange with undisguised curiosity, seemed reluctant to leave. "But Dad—" "Now, please," Miles said firmly. With a dramatic sigh that only pre-teens seemed capable of producing, Noah trudged off toward the creek. Miles turned back to find Richard studying him with new interest. "You must be the hired help," Richard said, extending a manicured hand. "Richard Westbrook Development." Miles shook the offered hand briefly, noting the lack of calluses. "Miles Parker." "Mr. Parker is repairing the barn," Eleanor explained, though her tone suggested she didn't feel she owed Richard any explanation at all. Richard glanced at the barn, his expression making it clear he saw little value in the structure. "Still clinging to the past, I see." He turned back to Eleanor, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Eleanor, we need to talk. The offer I made last month won't stay on the table forever." "Good," Eleanor said crisply. "Then I won't have to keep refusing it." Miles shifted uncomfortably, feeling like an intruder in a private battle. "I should get back to work." "No!" Eleanor said quickly, placing a hand on his arm. The touch was light, but Miles felt it like an anchor. "Please stay. This won't take long." She turned back to Richard. "I told you before, the Hayes farm is not for sale. Not to you, not to Westbrook Development, not to anyone." Richard sighed, the sound theatrical in its exasperation. "Eleanor, be reasonable. This land is worth millions to the right developer. You're sitting on a gold mine, and for what? Sentimentality, a barn that's falling apart, fields that barely produce enough to keep you afloat?" Eleanor's grip on Miles's arm tightened almost imperceptibly. "This land has been in my family for 4 generations, Richard. It's not just property to me." "Your husband's been gone for 5 years," Richard pressed, his voice softening in a way that seemed calculated rather than genuine. "Don't you think William would want you to move forward, to secure your future?" Miles felt Eleanor stiffen beside him, her breath catching slightly. It was the first he'd heard of her husband, though he'd guessed she was a widow from the way. She lived alone from the solitary air that surrounded her like a familiar shawl. "Don't," Eleanor said, her voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare use William to manipulate me." Richard held up his hands in a gesture of surrender, though his eyes remained cold. "I'm just trying to help an old friend see reason. The county's changing, Eleanor. Progress is coming whether you want it or not. You can be part of it or you can be left behind." "I think you should leave," Miles found himself saying, surprising even himself with the protective edge in his voice. "Ms. Hayes has made her position clear." Richard's gaze snapped to Miles, assessing him with new interest. "I don't believe this concerns you, Mr. Parker. You're standing on her property, making her uncomfortable," Miles replied evenly. "That makes it my concern." A tense silence stretched between them, broken finally by Richard's cold laugh. "I see you found yourself a white knight, Eleanor. How charming." He stepped back, straightening his suit jacket with deliberate casualness. "I'll go, but this conversation isn't over. The offer stands for another 2 weeks. After that, well..." He smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Let's just say there are other ways to acquire what Westbrook Development needs." With that veiled threat hanging in the air, Richard returned to his SUV and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Eleanor released her grip on Miles's arm, exhaling slowly. "I apologize for involving you in that," she said, her voice steady despite the lingering tension in her shoulders. Miles shook his head. "No need to apologize. Men like that only understand one thing: a united front." Eleanor looked at him with something like surprise, as if she'd expected a different reaction. After a moment, she smiled faintly. "Thank you." "For what it's worth," Miles added, "I think you're right to hold on to this place. Land like this, with history like this, it means something." The look Eleanor gave him then was complicated, layered with emotions Miles couldn't fully decipher. Gratitude, certainly, but also a wistfulness, as if she was seeing something, or someone, beyond him. "Not many people would understand that," she said softly. Miles shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "I've seen enough places to know when one's special." Before Eleanor could respond, Noah came bounding back, his earlier reluctance forgotten. "Dad, Dad! I found another frog, and this one's even bigger. Can I keep it, please?" The tension of the moment dissolved as Miles turned to his son, grateful for the interruption. "No, buddy, we can't keep it. Wild things belong in the wild." Noah's face fell, but he rallied quickly. "Can I at least name it before we leave it here?" Miles chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Sure, why not?" As Noah launched into an elaborate explanation of why Sir Jump-a-Lot was the only appropriate name for a frog of such obvious nobility, Miles caught Eleanor watching them, her expression soft and a little sad. For a moment, he wondered about The life she'd had before, about William, about the children they might have had or planned to have, about the dreams that had perhaps died with him. Then Eleanor caught his gaze and smiled, the sadness tucking itself away behind a practical exterior once more. "We should get back to work if we want to finish the east section before sundown." Miles nodded, pulling his focus back to the task at hand. Richard Westbrook's visit had revealed more about Eleanor's situation than she had probably intended to share. But Miles knew better than to pry. Everyone had their stories, their scars, their battles. He had his own, after all. They worked until the sun began to dip below the western hills, casting long shadows across the land. By the time they finished for the day, they had made significant progress on the barn's roof, replacing rotted beams and securing loose shingles. It was good, honest work, the kind that left a satisfying ache in the muscles and a sense of tangible accomplishment. As Miles packed up his tools, Noah appeared at his side, eyes bright with the day's adventures. "Dad, can we come back tomorrow? Miss Eleanor said she might show me how to fish in the creek." Miles glanced at Eleanor, who stood a few feet away, giving them space for this conversation. "We'll be back to work on the barn," he said carefully, "but fishing might have to wait for another time. Miss Eleanor is busy." Eleanor stepped forward then, her earlier reserve softened by the day's shared labor. "Actually, I was thinking Sunday might be good for fishing if you're both free. The barn can rest for one day." The invitation hung in the air between them, offering more than just a fishing trip, offering connection, offering roots, however temporary. Miles felt the familiar urge to pull back, to protect himself and Noah from the inevitable pain of leaving. But Noah was looking up at him with such hope, such excitement, that Miles found himself nodding. "Sunday sounds good," he said, surprising himself. "We'd like that." The smile that spread across Eleanor's face then was like the dawn breaking over the valley, gradual, warm, illuminating. Sunday it is. As Miles and Noah drove back to their rented cabin, the setting sun turning the dusty road golden, Noah chattered excitedly about frogs and fish and all the treasures he'd discovered in just one day at the Hayes farm. Miles listened, one part of his mind cataloguing his son's joy, while another part warned him about the dangerous territory they were entering. Oakridge Valley was supposed to be just another stop, just another job. Eleanor Hayes was supposed to be just another client, but something about the land, about her quiet strength and the shadows behind her eyes, about the way she treated Noah with genuine interest rather than forced politeness. Something was different here. Miles had spent 3 years making sure they never stayed long enough to put down roots, never lingered long enough for the pain of leaving to match the pain they'd already endured. It was safer that way, cleaner, no messy attachments, no new losses to bear. But as they pulled up to their temporary home, the cabin a dark silhouette against the twilight sky, Miles couldn't help but wonder if they were both missing something vital in their constant motion. If in running from the pain of the past, they were also running from the possibility of a future. These thoughts followed him into the cabin, stayed with him as he prepared a simple dinner, lingered as he tucked Noah into bed. They were still there as he stood on the porch alone, looking up at the vast expanse of stars, wondering if Karen was somewhere among them, watching over them still. "What would you tell me to do?" he whispered to the night sky. But the stars, magnificent as they were, offered no answers. Only the silent, constant reminder that life continued, that the universe was vast, and that perhaps their small story was just beginning a new chapter. Miles didn't know what Oakridge Valley held for them beyond the repair of Eleanor's barn. He didn't know if they would leave as planned or if something would shift, changing the course they'd set for themselves 3 years ago. For now, there, was only tomorrow and the work it would bring, and the quiet presence of Eleanor Hayes with her silver-streaked hair and her working hands and her history that seemed to run as deep as the land itself. For tonight, that would have to be enough. Unday arrived with a clarity that seemed almost deliberate, as if the universe had swept away every cloud just for this occasion. The creek that wound through Eleanor's property sparkled in the morning light, water tumbling over smooth stones, with a musical constancy that made Miles feel more at peace than he had in months. Noah was practically vibrating with excitement as they pulled up to the farmhouse, fishing rods hastily purchased from the general store in town jutting from the bed of the pickup. He'd been up since dawn, peppering Miles with questions about fishing techniques that Miles, who had only gone fishing a handful of times in his life, was woefully unprepared to answer. "Do you think we'll catch a really big one? Like one of those bass they show on TV?" Noah asked, hopping out of the truck before Miles had even switched off the engine. "Let's manage our expectations, buddy," Miles cautioned, though he couldn't help but smile at his son's enthusiasm. It had been a long time since he'd seen Noah this animated about anything. Eleanor was waiting for them on the porch, her usual practical attire replaced by a light blue button-down shirt and jeans that looked newer than her work clothes. Her hair was still in its practical bun, but there was something different about her today, a subtle lightness in her bearing, as if she too had shed some invisible weight for the occasion. "Right on time," she called, stepping down to meet them. In her hands was a wicker basket, the kind Miles had only seen in old movies. A genuine picnic basket, complete with a checkered cloth peeking out from beneath the lid. "We brought the fishing stuff," Noah announced proudly, gesturing to the rods in the truck bed. "Dad let me pick out my own lures." Eleanor smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Perfect, and I've got lunch for when we get hungry." The three of them walked together toward the creek, Noah darting ahead and then circling back like an excited puppy, unable to contain his energy in a straight line. Miles and Eleanor followed at a more measured pace, a comfortable silence between them, broken only by Noah's occasional exclamations about something he'd spotted. A butterfly, an interesting rock, a cloud shaped exactly like a dinosaur, Dad. "Look, he's always like this?" Eleanor asked, watching Noah with amusement. Miles chuckled. "Only when he's excited, which admittedly is a lot of the time." "It's refreshing," Eleanor said softly. "This place has been too quiet for too long." There was a wealth of meaning in those simple words, a glimpse into Eleanor's solitary existence that made Miles wonder what her life had been like before William's death, before Richard Westbrook's pressure campaigns, before a wandering handyman and his son appeared on her doorstep. The creek widened as they reached Eleanor's favorite fishing spot, a small clearing where the water pooled into a relatively calm expanse before continuing its journey downhill. Ancient willows provided dappled shade, their drooping branches creating natural curtains that sectioned off this small piece of paradise from the rest of the world. "My father brought me here when I was about Noah's age," Eleanor said, setting down her basket on a flat rock. "Said it was the best spot in the county for brook trout." "Was he right?" Miles asked, helping Noah untangle his fishing line from where it had snagged on his shoelace. Eleanor's smile was tinged with memory. "I caught my first fish here when I was 9. It was barely bigger than my hand, but you'd have thought I'd landed a whale from the way my father carried on." She showed Noah how to bait his hook, her movements deft and practiced, despite what must have been years since she'd last done this. Miles watched them together, struck by how natural they looked. Eleanor patient and instructive, Noah attentive in a way he rarely was with adults who weren't Miles. "You're a good teacher," Miles observed, when Noah had successfully cast his line into the water and was sitting on a rock, legs swinging, eyes fixed on the float with intense concentration. Eleanor shrugged, though he could tell the compliment pleased her. It's easy with an eager student. They settled on either side of Noah, casting their own lines into the clear water. The morning passed in a pleasant haze of quiet conversation, occasional laughter when one of them, usually Miles, fumbled with their fishing rod and the hypnotic rhythm of the creek. Noah, to his immense pride, caught the first fish, a modestly sized trout that Eleanor helped him unhook and release back into the water. "But why can't we keep it?" Noah asked, watching as the fish darted away. "Because we're guests here," Eleanor explained, her tone respectful rather than condescending. "The fish belong to the creek, and the creek belongs to the valley. We borrow, we don't take." Noah considered this with unusual seriousness. "Like how we're staying in Mr. Halloran's cabin?" "Something like that," Miles agreed, surprised by his son's connection. "We're just passing through." Something flickered across Eleanor's face at his words, a brief shadow that was gone so quickly, Miles almost thought he'd imagined it. But before he could dwell on it, Noah was tugging excitedly at his sleeve. "Dad, your float is going under!" The rest of the morning was filled with small triumphs. Miles catching a respectable trout, Eleanor demonstrating how to properly cast into a difficult spot, Noah learning the patience that fishing demanded. By the time the sun had reached its zenith, they had caught and released half a dozen fish between them, and Noah had declared this the best day ever. Seriously, Dad, ever. They broke for lunch, spreading Eleanor's checkered cloth beneath the shade of the largest willow. The basket revealed homemade sandwiches, a jar of lemonade that tasted of summer itself, and cookies that Noah proclaimed were even better than the ones at the bakery in Phoenix, their last semi-permanent home. As they ate, Eleanor told stories of growing up on the farm, of climbing the apple trees in the orchard beyond the barn, of helping her father bring in the harvest, of winter nights spent reading by the fire while snow piled up outside. Miles found himself captivated by these glimpses into her life, these threads of a tapestry he was only just beginning to see. "What about you?" Eleanor asked eventually. "Noah mentioned Phoenix." Miles nodded, tensing slightly as he always did when conversation veered toward their past. "We were there for almost 6 months. Before that, Albuquerque for a few months, then a town in Texas so small it barely had a name." Eleanor seemed to sense his reluctance to elaborate. "And before the traveling?" Miles felt Noah's attention shift to him, his son's eyes wide and watchful. They rarely spoke about the before, the settled life they'd had, the home they'd lost in more ways than one. "We lived in Portland," Miles said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Had a small contracting business, a house in the suburbs, the American dream more or less." He didn't add what they both knew, that the dream had shattered the night. Karen's car never made it home, that the house had been sold to pay medical bills and funeral costs, that the business had collapsed under the weight of Miles's grief. Some things didn't need to be said aloud to be understood. Eleanor didn't push, and Miles was grateful for her perception. Instead, she turned to Noah. "And what about you? What's your favorite subject in school?" Noah launched into an enthusiastic description of his latest science project, something involving potato batteries that he'd had to abandon when they'd moved again. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was truly engaging with his excited explanations. Miles watched them, a strange feeling settling in his chest. It had been a long time since Noah had interacted like this, with an adult who wasn't Miles or a teacher. The constant moving made lasting connections impossible, and Miles had told himself that was for the best. Fewer attachments meant fewer painful goodbyes. But seeing Noah now, animated and engaged, Miles wondered if he had been protecting his son or depriving him. After lunch, as they packed up their fishing gear, Eleanor pointed toward a small hill that rose behind the creek. "There's a view from the top that's worth the climb if you're interested." Noah was immediately game, his energy seemingly inexhaustible. Miles hesitated, knowing they should probably head back. He had promised Jim Halloran he'd look at a leaking roof at the main house later that afternoon. "You should go," Eleanor said, as if reading his thoughts. "I can take care of this." She gestured to their picnic supplies. Miles shook his head. "I can't ask you to clean up after us." "You didn't ask," Eleanor pointed out with a small smile. "I offered. Besides, it's not every day that boy of yours gets to see what the whole valley looks like from above." There was something in her tone, not quite wistfulness, not quite insistence, that made Miles relent. "All right, but we'll be quick." Noah was already halfway up the slope, calling for Miles to hurry up. With a grateful nod to Eleanor, Miles followed his son, his long legs quickly making up the distance between them. The hill wasn't particularly steep, but it was high enough that by the time they reached the summit, both Miles and Noah were breathing hard. The effort was immediately forgotten, however, when they turned to take in the view. Oakridge Valley spread before them in a panorama of greens and golds, the creek a silver ribbon weaving through fields and woodland. Eleanor's farm sat nestled at the heart of it all, the white farmhouse and red barn, like something from a painting of rural America. But what took Miles's breath away was the scope of it. From up here, he could see that Eleanor's property didn't end at the barn or the immediate fields around it. It extended far into the distance, encompassing thousands of acres of prime farmland, stretching almost to the horizon. "Whoa," Noah breathed beside him. "It's like she owns the whole world." Miles couldn't disagree. From this vantage point, it was clear that Eleanor Hayes owned much more than a modest family farm. She owned what had to be the majority of Oakridge Valley itself. "Dad," Noah said, tugging at his sleeve. "Look over there." Miles followed his son's pointing finger to where, at the far eastern edge of the valley, construction equipment stood like yellow beetles against the landscape. Even from this distance, it was clear that something substantial was being built, something that encroached on the natural beauty of the valley. "Is that part of Miss Eleanor's farm too?" Noah asked. Miles frowned, remembering Richard Westbrook's veiled threats. "I'm not sure, buddy. Let's head back down." As they descended the hill, Miles' mind was racing. If Eleanor owned all that land that, as Richard had pointed out, was worth millions to developers, why was she living so modestly? Why was she hiring a traveling handyman to fix her barn instead of a professional crew? And why had she never mentioned the true extent of her holdings? Eleanor was packing the last of the picnic supplies when they returned, her expression brightening as she caught sight of them. "Well, what did you think?" "It's amazing," Noah exclaimed. "You can see forever up there." Eleanor smiled, though. Miles noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's why it's my favorite spot. Whenever I need perspective, that's where I go." "You didn't mention you owned half the valley," Miles said quietly, while Noah was distracted by a frog at the edge of the creek. Eleanor's gaze met his, steady and unreadable. Would it have mattered? Miles wasn't sure how to answer that. Would it have changed how he approached the barn repair, how he interacted with her? He wanted to say no, but he couldn't be certain. "I'm just trying to understand," he said finally. "If the land is worth as much as Westbrook says, why fight so hard to keep it as it is? Why not sell at least part of it?" Eleanor was quiet for so long that Miles thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was soft but firm. "Because some things matter more than money. Because my family didn't build this place for it to become condos and shopping malls. Because this valley is more than just real estate. It's a legacy, and I'm its caretaker." The conviction in her voice was like a physical force, and Miles found himself nodding, not in agreement necessarily, but in respect for her position. He understood loyalty to the past. Wasn't his own rootless existence a reaction to what he'd lost? a way of honoring it by refusing to replace it. "I didn't mean to pry," he said. Eleanor's expression softened. "You didn't. It's a fair question. I just don't talk about it much, because in Oakridge, the Hayes land has always been the Hayes land. It's just a fact of life, like the mountains or the seasons." They walked back to the farmhouse in companionable silence, Noah ranging ahead of them, still buzzing from a day of new experiences. As they reached Miles's truck, Eleanor paused, her hand resting lightly on the gate. "Thank you for today," she said. "It's been a long time since I've enjoyed company like this." Miles found himself wanting to prolong the moment, to say something meaningful, but all that came out was, "We should be thanking you." "Noah hasn't stopped smiling all day." Eleanor glanced at Noah, who was now examining something in the dirt near the porch steps. "He's a special boy. You've done well with him." The simple compliment hit Miles with unexpected force. Parenting. Alone, always on the move, he rarely received validation that he was doing okay, that Noah was thriving despite the challenges of their lifestyle. "We do our best," he managed, his throat suddenly tight. Eleanor seemed to sense the emotion behind his words. With a small nod, she stepped back. "I'll see you tomorrow for the barn work." "Bright and early," Miles confirmed, grateful for the return to practicalities. As they drove away, Noah waved enthusiastically from the passenger window until Eleanor was just a distant figure by the farmhouse. The boy then settled back in his seat with a contented sigh. "I like her," he announced. "She doesn't talk to me like I'm a baby." Miles smiled, navigating the winding road back toward town. "She's a good person." "Can we help her with the land stuff?" The man in the fancy car seemed mean. Miles glanced at his son, surprised by his perception. "It's complicated, buddy. Miss Eleanor has to make her own decisions about her land." Noah frowned, processing this. "But we could still be her friends, right? Even if we're just passing through." The question hit uncomfortably close to thoughts Miles had been trying to avoid. What were they doing here, forming connections? They would inevitably sever when the job was done. Wasn't that unfair to Noah, to Eleanor, to themselves? "We can be friendly," Miles said carefully. "But remember, when the barn is fixed, we'll be moving on. That's how it works for us." Noah was quiet for a moment, looking out at the passing landscape. "I know," he said finally, his voice smaller than before. "I just thought maybe this time could be different." Miles had no answer for that, and they drove the rest of the way in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The following week passed, in a blur of work and unexpected moments of connection. Miles and Eleanor fell into a rhythm, working side by side on the barn repair, their conversations flowing more easily with each passing day. She told him about her late husband, William, a professor at the state university who had died suddenly of a heart attack 5 years earlier. In return, Miles found himself sharing stories about Karen, small anecdotes he had kept locked away for years. Noah, meanwhile, had appointed himself official assistant, ferrying tools and water, chattering endlessly about his explorations of the farm when not needed. He had even started bringing his schoolwork to the barn, spreading his books on a makeshift desk of hay bales while Miles and Eleanor worked. It was domestic in a way that Miles had deliberately avoided since Karen's death, and he found himself both drawn to and fearful of the easy camaraderie they were developing. The true complexity of Eleanor's situation became clearer as the days passed. Oakridge was a town at a crossroads, with the older generation clinging to its rural identity, while younger residents increasingly looked toward development and change. Eleanor, with her vast holdings of undeveloped land, stood at the center of this tension. "Richard's not wrong about everything," she admitted one afternoon as they took a break, sharing a thermos of coffee in the shade of the barn. "The town is struggling. The young people leave because there aren't enough jobs. The tax base is shrinking. Development would bring money, employment. But at what cost? Miles asked, watching as Noah attempted to teach himself to do a handstand. Against the far wall, Eleanor sighed, her gaze drifting over the landscape she had known all her life. That's the question, isn't it? What's the value of open space, of history, of a way of life that's increasingly rare? How do you measure that against economic progress? Miles didn't have an answer, but he understood the weight of the decision she faced. It wasn't as simple as one stubborn woman refusing to sell her land. It was about the soul of a community, about balancing past and future, tradition and change. On Thursday, a thunderstorm rolled through the valley, forcing them to abandon work on the barn earlier than planned. Miles and Noah were about to make a dash for the truck when Eleanor stopped them. "You'll be soaked before you even start the engine," she said, watching as lightning forked across the darkening sky. "Come inside until it passes." The invitation was practical rather than social, but crossing the threshold of Eleanor's farmhouse felt significant nonetheless. The interior was exactly what Miles would have expected. Comfortable but not luxurious, filled with furniture that valued function over fashion. Family photographs lined the walls, generations of Hayes family members staring out from simple frames. While Noah explored the bookshelves with reverent curiosity, Eleanor made hot chocolate for all three of them. Miles found himself in the kitchen with her, drawn by the domestic normality of the scene. "You could have sold all this years ago," he said, watching as she stirred milk in a saucepan. "Move somewhere easier to manage, especially on your own." Eleanor glanced at him, a small smile playing at her lips. "I could have, but this is home. Every creak in the floorboards, every view from every window, it's part of me." Miles understood that feeling, or at least he remembered understanding it. There had been a time when his and Karen's small house in Portland had felt like an extension of themselves, when he couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Now home was wherever he and Noah happened to be, a concept rather than a place. "Besides," Eleanor continued, pouring the hot chocolate into mugs, "selling would feel like betraying William. He loved this place as much as I do, learned to love it because I did. The last thing we talked about, the night before he died, was renovating the orchard, planting new apple trees for the future." There was no self-pity in her voice, just a matter-of-fact recounting of loss and the promises that survived it. Miles felt a surge of respect for this woman who had faced grief not by running from it, as he had, but by honoring the life and love that had come before. The storm passed eventually, but not before the three of them had spent 2 hours in Eleanor's living room, drinking hot chocolate, playing an ancient board game unearthed from a closet, and listening to the rain drum against the windows. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon that Miles had forgotten could feel so extraordinary, a momentary refuge from the constant motion of their lives. As they finally prepared to leave, the sky clearing to reveal a spectacular sunset, Eleanor paused at the door. "Noah mentioned you're staying at Jim Halloran's hunting cabin?" Miles nodded, wondering where this was leading. "Jim's a good man, but that cabin isn't meant for long-term living," Eleanor said. "The farmhand's cottage on my property has been empty since my last helper moved to Colorado. It's small, but it has proper heating and plumbing. You and Noah are welcome to use it while you're working on the barn." The offer hung between them, innocuous on the surface, but laden with implications. Moving onto Eleanor's property, even temporarily, would cross a line Miles had carefully maintained in all their previous stops, the line between professional engagement and personal involvement. "That's very generous," Miles began already, formulating a polite refusal. "But, Dad, can we?" Noah interrupted, his face alight with excitement. "Please! It's probably really close to the creek, and I bet there are even more frogs. And maybe Miss Eleanor would let me help with the chickens she was telling me about." Miles looked from his son's hopeful face to Eleanor's carefully neutral one. She wasn't pushing, wasn't trying to persuade him. She had simply offered and was waiting for his decision. "The cottage has been sitting empty for months," she added. Quietly, "It would be good to have it lived in again, even briefly, and it would save you the drive each day." It was the practicality of this last point that finally swayed Miles. The Halloran cabin was a 20-minute drive from Eleanor's farm, and with gas prices what they were, the savings would be significant. "If you're sure it's no trouble," he said finally, "just until the barn is finished." Eleanor nodded, though Miles thought he caught a flicker of something like triumph in her eyes. "Of course, no trouble at all." As they drove back to the Halloran cabin to collect their meager belongings, Miles tried to ignore the voice in his head warning him that he was making a mistake, that he was allowing himself and Noah to become too attached to a place and a person who would soon be part of their past. Noah, oblivious to his father's concerns, chattered excitedly about their new temporary home. "Do you think the cottage has a loft? I've always wanted to sleep in a loft. And maybe Miss Eleanor will let me have breakfast with her sometimes, and I can help collect the eggs like she was telling me about." Miles smiled despite his unease. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, buddy. This is just a convenient arrangement while we finish the job, that's all." But even as he said it, Miles knew he was trying to convince himself as much as Noah. Because the truth was, Oakridge Valley was beginning to feel less like another stop on their endless journey and more like a place they might actually belong. And that possibility was as terrifying as it was tempting. The farmhand's cottage was nestled behind a stand of old oak trees about 100 yards from the main farmhouse. It was small but charming, with whitewashed walls, a modest porch, and windows that caught the morning light. Inside was simple but comfortable, a main room with a kitchenette and sitting area, one bedroom, and a surprisingly modern bathroom. A narrow ladder led to a loft space that Noah immediately claimed as his domain. "This is awesome," he declared, peering down at Miles from his new perch. "I can see everything from up here." Miles had to admit the cottage was far more comfortable than the Halloran cabin, with its drafty windows and temperamental plumbing. Still, he felt a strange nervousness as they settled in, as if by accepting Eleanor's offer, he had tacitly agreed to something more significant than a change of lodging. The feeling intensified the next morning when Eleanor appeared at their door with a basket of eggs, fresh bread, and homemade jam. "Housewarming," she explained with a small smile. "Though I suppose that's the wrong term for such a temporary arrangement." There was a hint of a question in her voice, or perhaps Miles only imagined it. Either way, he didn't address it, simply thanking her for the welcome breakfast. Noah, still in his pajamas, was less restrained. "This is the best place we've ever stayed," he announced, accepting a slice of bread topped with jam. "Way better than that motel in Albuquerque where the neighbors played loud music all night." Eleanor laughed, the sound warming the cottage more effectively than the morning sun streaming through the windows. "I'm glad it meets with your approval." As they ate breakfast together, an impromptu affair with Eleanor perched on the edge of the sofa and Noah cross-legged on the floor, Miles found himself studying her in the soft morning light. There was an ease to her in this setting, as if sharing a simple meal in the cottage was more natural than their more formal interactions at the main house had been. When Noah excused himself to get dressed, Eleanor turned to Miles, her expression growing more serious. "Richard Westbrook came by again yesterday," she said, "after you'd left." Miles frowned, setting down his coffee cup. "What did he want?" "He'd done the same thing he always wants, to convince me to sell." She sighed, running a hand through her hair, which for once was loose around her shoulders. "But this time, he had a new approach. He's organizing a town hall meeting next week to discuss the future of Oakridge Valley, which really means he's going to try to turn public opinion against me." "Can he do that?" Eleanor's smile was grim. "This is a small town, Miles. People talk." And Richard is very good at making his case sound reasonable. Development means jobs, tax revenue, progress. Standing in the way of that makes me the villain of the piece. Miles felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. You're fighting to preserve something valuable. That doesn't make you a villain. In some eyes it does, Eleanor replied. Especially when those eyes belong to young families struggling to make ends meet, to parents watching their children move away because there's nothing here for them. The complexity of her position struck Miles anew. Eleanor wasn't just fighting for her family's legacy. She was caught in the cross-currents of a changing community, trying to balance personal conviction against collective need. "Will you go to the meeting?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. "I have to. If I don't show up, it only confirms what Richard will say about me, that I'm an out-of-touch landowner who doesn't care about the town's future." Miles hesitated, then said, "Would you like company?" The question seemed to surprise her. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Gratitude, yes, but also something more complex. "You don't have to get involved in this," she said. "It's not your fight." Miles shrugged, surprising himself with his next words. "Maybe it could be." Before Eleanor could respond, Noah bounded back into the room, fully dressed and eager to start the day. The moment passed, but Miles caught Eleanor watching him thoughtfully as they cleared away the breakfast things and prepared to head to the barn. Moving to the cottage changed more than just their living arrangements. Being on the property, Miles and Noah became part of the daily rhythm of farm life. They were present for sunrise over the fields, for the evening chorus of crickets and frogs, for the quiet moments when Eleanor sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the world she had fought so hard to preserve. The town hall of Oakridge Valley was a modest brick building that had served as the center of local governance since 1924. Its high ceilings and wooden benches spoke of an earlier era, when community meetings were considered civic duties rather than inconveniences. Tonight, however, the old building was filled beyond capacity, with residents standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Miles had never seen so many of Oakridge's citizens in one place, a testament to how deeply Richard Westbrook's proposed development affected them all. Eleanor sat beside him in the third row, her back straight, her expression composed despite the nervous energy emanating from her. She wore a simple navy dress, more formal than her usual attire, but still understated, as if unwilling to present herself as anything other than what she was, a steward of the land, not its possessor. Noah had stayed back at the cottage with Mrs. Jameson, an elderly neighbor who had offered to watch him when she'd heard they were attending the meeting. Miles was grateful for the arrangement. He suspected tonight's discussion would be too heated for a child's ears. "Half the town is here," Miles murmured, scanning the crowd. He recognized faces from the general store, the diner, the gas station, places he'd frequented during their stay in Oakridge. Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on the empty podium at the front of the room. "This isn't just about my land. It's about what kind of place Oakridge will be for the next generation." Before Miles could respond, the side door opened and Richard Westbrook strode in, flanked by two younger men in similar expensive suits. Richard moved with the confident ease of someone who knew how to command a room, smiling and nodding to various attendees as he made his way to the front. A few people greeted him warmly, though Miles noted that others watched with wary expressions. Mayor Jenkins, a portly man with a receding hairline and perpetually flustered demeanor, called the meeting to order. After a perfunctory welcome, he introduced Richard as a friend of Oakridge with an exciting vision for our future. Richard took the podium with practiced grace, his smile sincere enough to almost mask the calculation behind his eyes. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice warm and engaging. It's heartening to see so many faces I've known since childhood, as well as some newer additions to our community. His gaze swept the room, briefly meeting Miles's before moving on. We're all here because we care about Oakridge Valley, about preserving what makes it special while ensuring it can thrive in changing times. Miles felt Eleanor tense slightly beside him as Richard launched into a well-rehearsed presentation about Oakridge Crossings, the development his company proposed for the eastern portion of the valley, the area Miles and Noah had spotted from the hilltop. Using digital slides projected onto the wall, Richard outlined a vision of modern housing, retail spaces, and a corporate campus that would bring Oakridge into the 21st century without sacrificing its character. The images were compelling. Tasteful buildings nestled among preserved trees, walking paths alongside carefully landscaped green spaces, families enjoying outdoor activities in a setting that balanced nature with modern amenities. Even Miles, who had come prepared to be skeptical, could see the appeal of Richard's vision. Oakridge Crossings would create over 200 permanent jobs, Richard continued, his voice rising with conviction. It would expand our tax base, allowing for improvements to schools, roads, and public services. It would give our young people a reason to stay instead of moving to the city, and it would do all this while preserving the natural beauty that makes this valley special. Murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. Miles glanced at Eleanor, whose face remained impassive, though he could see her knuckles whitening where she gripped her purse. "The only obstacle," Richard said, his tone shifting to one of reluctant regret, "is the fact that the land best suited for this development, land that currently sits unused, generating nothing for the community, is unavailable." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. The Hayes property, which comprises nearly 60% of Oakridge Valley's developable land, has been kept off the market despite multiple generous offers. All eyes turned toward Eleanor. Miles felt a surge of protective anger at the transparent attempt to make her a public target. But Eleanor didn't shrink from the attention. Instead, she met the gazes directed at her with quiet dignity. Richard continued, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic. "I understand the emotional attachment to family land. I truly do. My own grandfather owned a farm just north of here. But there comes a time when we must ask ourselves, what serves the greater good? What legacy do we want to leave for the next generation of Oakridge residents?" With that skillful pivot, Richard had framed the issue as Eleanor's personal sentimentality versus the community's future prosperity. It was masterfully done, and Miles could see it landing effectively with much of the audience. Mayor Jenkins reclaimed the podium, thanking Richard for his presentation before opening the floor to community comments. The first few speakers rose to express enthusiastic support for the development, citing concerns about the town's economic stagnation, the lack of opportunities for young people, and the need for updated infrastructure. "My daughter had to move to Springfield to find work," said Martha Deacon, who owned the local beauty salon. "She wants to come home, but there's nothing here for someone with a business degree. This development could change that." Similar testimonials followed, each one adding weight to Richard's argument that Oakridge needed this change, that progress couldn't be held back by one woman's attachment to the past. Miles watched as Eleanor absorbed each comment, her expression revealing nothing, though he sensed the emotional toll this public scrutiny was taking. Then a hand rose from the back row and Jim Halloran stood up. The older man's weathered face was set in determined lines as he addressed the room. "I've lived in this valley all my life, just like my father before me," he began, his gravelly voice carrying clearly. "I've seen changes come and go, some good, some not so good. But this development..." He shook his head. "This isn't about the future of Oakridge. It's about profit, plain and simple." Richard started to interject, but Jim held up a hand. I'm not finished, Westbrook. You talk about jobs, but what kind of jobs? Retail, service, low-paying positions that won't support a family? Meanwhile, you'll be destroying farmland that's been productive for generations. Nulg. The Hayes farm hasn't been truly productive in years, Richard countered smoothly. Most of that land sits fallow. That's because Eleanor Hayes has been managing alone since William died, Jim replied sharply. But that land isn't just about what it produces today. It's about what it can produce tomorrow, next year, for the next 100 years. Once you pave it over, that's it, gone forever. A murmur of consideration moved through the crowd. Miles saw several people nodding in agreement with Jim's points. Another resident stood, a middle-aged woman Miles recognized as the librarian. I'm concerned about the environmental impact, she said. That eastern section of the valley is a watershed. What happens to our water quality if it's developed? Our environmental impact studies, Richard began, but the librarian wasn't finished. And what about traffic? Our roads can barely handle what we have now. 200 new homes means at least 400 more cars. More voices joined in, questions and concerns that hadn't been addressed in Richard's polished presentation. Miles realized that while Richard had vocal supporters, there was also significant skepticism about his plans. The community wasn't as united behind the development as it had first appeared. Finally, Mayor Jenkins called on Eleanor, who had raised her hand. The room fell silent as she stood, every eye upon her. Miles gave her a small nod of encouragement. I'd like to thank everyone for their comments, both those in support of Mr. Westbrook's proposal and those with concerns, she began, her voice steady and clear. I understand the frustration some of you feel. Oakridge is changing, and change is never easy. She paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with various residents. The Hayes farm has been part of this valley since before Oakridge was incorporated as a town. My great-grandfather plowed those fields with horses. My grandfather expanded the orchard during the Depression, providing fruit for families who had nothing else. My father modernized the operation in the 1960s, employing dozens of local residents. Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she continued. I've been accused of holding on to the past at the expense of the future, of valuing sentimentality over progress. But that's not the choice we're facing. The question isn't whether to change or stay the same. It's what kind of change will truly benefit Oakridge in the long run. She turned slightly to face Richard. Mr. Westbrook's development would bring short-term economic benefits, yes, but at what cost? Once that land is gone, it's gone forever. And with it, the opportunity to use it in ways that might better serve the community. Richard smiled indulgently. And what ways would those be, Eleanor? The farm hasn't been profitable in years. Not every value can be measured in dollars, Eleanor replied evenly. But if it's economics you're concerned with, I have an alternative proposal. This caught everyone's attention, including Miles, who hadn't been aware Eleanor was planning to offer a counter-proposal. I've been working with the State Agricultural Extension Office and a consortium of organic farming cooperatives, Eleanor continued. We've been developing a plan to convert portions of the Hayes farm into a sustainable agriculture center that would include training programs, research facilities, and direct-to-consumer food production. She outlined a vision different from Richard's but no less compelling, a future where Oakridge became known for innovative agricultural practices, where young people could learn valuable skills, where the land remained productive in new ways that honored its history while adapting to changing times. This approach would create jobs too, Eleanor concluded. Maybe not as many as a shopping mall, and maybe not as quickly, but they would be meaningful jobs connected to the land, jobs that couldn't be outsourced or automated, and the land would remain open, protecting our watershed and wildlife while still contributing to the community's prosperity. When Eleanor finished speaking, the room was quiet. residents digesting this unexpected alternative. Miles felt a surge of admiration for her, not just for her vision, but for her courage in standing before her neighbors to defend it. Richard recovered quickly, offering a diplomatic smile. "That's certainly an interesting concept, Eleanor. But I have to question whether it's realistic. Our projections show that Oakridge crossings would generate 10 times the revenue of even the most successful agricultural operation." "Your projections are based on assumptions that prioritize short-term gains over long-term sustainability," Eleanor countered. "And they don't account for the less tangible benefits of preserving open space." The debate continued, with community members weighing in on both proposals. Miles noticed that while Richard's supporters remained vocal, Eleanor's alternative had resonated with many residents who had previously been silent. The meeting, scheduled for 1 hour, stretched to nearly 3 as the discussion grew increasingly nuanced. When Mayor Jenkins finally called for adjournment, nothing had been definitively resolved. Richard's development couldn't proceed without Eleanor's land, and Eleanor showed no signs of changing her position. But the conversation had shifted. No longer was it simply about one stubborn landowner blocking progress. Now it was about competing visions for Oakridge's future, each with their own merits and challenges. As people filed out of the town hall, Miles overheard snippets of conversation that suggested many were reconsidering their initial support for Richard's plan. Eleanor's alternative had given them something to think about, a possibility they hadn't previously considered. Richard approached them as they prepared to leave, his demeanor cordial, despite the evening's contentious exchanges. "You surprised me, Eleanor," he admitted. "I didn't know you had been working on an alternative." "You never asked," Eleanor replied simply. "You assumed I was just saying no without having a plan of my own." Richard's gaze shifted to Miles, assessing. "Mr. Parker, I understand you've taken up residence on the Hayes property." Miles met his gaze steadily. "Temporarily, while I work on the barn." "Ah yes, the barn." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Curious how that repair job seems to be taking longer than one might expect. Before Miles could respond, Eleanor stepped in. "Mr. Parker does quality work. That takes time." "Of course." Richard nodded, his attention returning to Eleanor. "This isn't over, you know. Your agricultural center is a nice idea, but it won't generate the kind of economic impact this town needs." "That remains to be seen," Eleanor replied calmly. "Good night, Richard." As they walked to Miles's truck, Eleanor's composed facade began to crumble. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the passenger door. "I've never spoken in public like that before," she admitted once they were inside. "Not about anything important." "You were incredible," Miles said, meaning it completely. "You changed the conversation, made people think beyond Richard's slick presentation." Eleanor exhaled slowly, leaning back against the seat. "Maybe, but Richard has resources I don't have. Money, connections, a team of experts to make his case. All I have is the land itself, and my belief that it deserves more than to be carved up for profit." Miles started the truck, the familiar rumble of its engine grounding him. "Don't underestimate what you accomplished tonight. You showed everyone that there's another way forward, one that doesn't require sacrificing what makes this place special." As they drove through the darkened streets of Oakridge, Miles found himself thinking about the competing visions for the valley's future. Richard's plan was seductive in its promise of immediate prosperity. Eleanor's required more patience, more faith in slower, sustainable growth. It wasn't hard to see which approach aligned more closely with his own recent life philosophy. Keep moving, don't put down roots, don't invest too deeply in any one place or future. Yet something about Eleanor's vision resonated with him in a way he hadn't expected. Perhaps because it acknowledged the value of history while still evolving, of honoring what came before while creating something new. It was the opposite of his own approach to grief, which had been to sever all ties with the past and keep running forward. When they arrived back at the farm, the cottage windows glowed with warm light. Mrs. Jameson met them at the door, reporting that Noah had been a perfect gentleman and was now fast asleep in the loft. After thanking her and seeing her safely to her car, Miles and Eleanor stood on the cottage porch, neither quite ready to end the evening. "Would you like to come in for some tea?" Miles offered, surprising himself. They had spent their days working together, but evenings had remained separate, a boundary Miles had maintained without quite acknowledging why. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Tea would be nice. Inside, Miles moved quietly through the small kitchen, filling the kettle and setting out mugs, while Eleanor settled on the sofa, her professional demeanor giving way to visible fatigue. The cottage felt different with her in it, smaller in some ways, but also more complete, as if her presence filled a space that had been empty before. "I've been meaning to ask you," Eleanor said, as Miles handed her a steaming mug, "how Noah is managing with all the moving around. He seems to adapt so easily, but children often hide what they're really feeling." The question caught Miles off guard. Most people either avoided mentioning their nomadic lifestyle or asked practical questions about logistics. Few inquired about the emotional impact on Noah. "He's resilient," Miles said after a moment. "More than I am, probably. But sometimes I wonder—" He trailed off, uncertain whether to voice the doubts that had been growing since they arrived. "In Oakridge." "Wonder what?" Eleanor prompted gently. Miles sighed, sitting beside her on the sofa. "If I'm doing the right thing. Keeping us constantly on the move, never staying anywhere long enough to form real connections. I tell myself it's practical, go where the work is, but the truth is, it's easier than the alternative. Which is, letting people in, risking loss again." The admission felt raw, vulnerable in a way Miles had avoided for years. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, sipping her tea. When she spoke, her voice was soft with understanding. "After William died, I considered selling, not to Richard, but to anyone who would take the burden off my shoulders. The farm felt too big, too empty without him. The idea of starting fresh, somewhere else, was tempting." "Why didn't you?" She set her mug down, her gaze distant. "Because running away wouldn't have changed the essential fact. I had lost someone irreplaceable. And eventually, I realized that staying here, surrounded by memories of him, of us, wasn't just painful. It was also comforting. This place held our history, and in a way, that kept part of him alive." Her words resonated more deeply than Miles wanted to admit. In his determination to outrun grief, had he also been outrunning the very memories that might have brought comfort? Had he deprived Noah of a sense of connection, not just to places, but to the mother he had lost too young? "I'm not saying your way is wrong," Eleanor added, perhaps sensing the weight of his thoughts. "Everyone heals differently, but from what I've seen, Noah thrives when he feels rooted. The way he's explored every inch of the farm, the questions he asks about its history, the pride he takes in helping with even small tasks. He's seeking connection, Miles, a sense of belonging." Miles couldn't deny the truth of her observation. Noah had blossomed during their time in Oakridge, becoming more confident, more engaged, more fully himself than Miles had seen in years. Was that simply the natural development of a growing boy? Or was it the result of finally staying in one place long enough to feel part of something? "The barn is almost finished," Miles said quietly, voicing the reality they had both been avoiding. "Another week, maybe 2 at most." Eleanor nodded, understanding the implication. "And then you'll move on." "That's how it works," Miles replied, though the words felt hollow for the first time since they'd begun their wandering life. "There's a job in Claiborne that would start right after." "Of course." Eleanor's voice was carefully neutral, but Miles caught the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. Claiborne isn't far. Maybe Noah could visit sometimes. The suggestion hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Visits would mean maintaining a connection, acknowledging that what had developed between them, whatever it was, had value beyond the temporary arrangement of employer and employee. Maybe, Miles said, not committing either way. The possibility both tempted and frightened him. They finished their tea in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. When Eleanor finally rose to leave, Miles walked her to the door, suddenly awkward in a way he hadn't been with her before. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," Eleanor said as she stepped onto the porch. "Having you there meant more than I can say." Miles nodded, unsure how to respond to the simple honesty of her gratitude. "You did all the hard work. I just sat there looking intimidating." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound warming the cool night air. "Is that what you were doing? I thought you were just frowning in concentration." "Multitasking," Miles replied, with a small smile. "Frowning can serve multiple purposes." Eleanor's laughter faded, replaced by something more serious, more searching. "Whatever happens with the land, with Richard's development, with my alternative plan, I'm glad you and Noah came to Oakridge, Miles. You've made a difference here, and not just to the barn." Before Miles could respond, she leaned forward and kissed his cheek, a brief, gentle gesture that was over almost before he registered it. Then she was walking across the moonlit yard toward the main house, leaving Miles standing on the porch, his hand unconsciously touching the spot where her lips had been. Inside the cottage, Miles moved quietly, checking on Noah, who was sleeping peacefully in the loft, before preparing for bed himself. But sleep proved elusive as his mind replayed the events of the evening, the town meeting, the drive home, the conversation with Eleanor, that brief kiss on the cheek that had felt more significant than its simplicity suggested. He found himself thinking about choices, about paths taken and avoided. For 3 years, he had chosen motion over stillness, detachment over connection, safety over vulnerability. It had seemed the only way to survive after losing Karen, the only way to protect himself and Noah from ever experiencing that kind of devastation again. But what if that choice, made in grief and fear, had become a prison rather than a protection? What if, in trying to spare Noah from potential loss, he had deprived him of the very connections that made life meaningful? And what about himself? Miles had been so focused on being strong for Noah, on putting one foot in front of the other, that he had stopped considering his own healing, his own future beyond the next job, the next town, the next temporary home. Eleanor Hayes, with her deep roots and her willingness to fight for what mattered, had unsettled something in him, challenged the narrative he had been living by since Karen's death. She had shown him a different way of honoring the past while still moving forward, of finding strength in connection rather than isolation. As Miles finally drifted towards sleep, the question that had been forming in the back of his mind for days finally crystallized. What if they stayed? Not just for the barn repair, not just for a few more weeks, but truly stayed. What would it mean to stop running, to put down roots in this valley that had already begun to feel like home? The thought was terrifying. It was also, Miles had to admit, exhilarating in a way nothing had been since before the accident that had changed everything. The following days brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere around Oakridge. Eleanor's alternative proposal had sparked community conversations that extended far beyond the town hall meeting. Miles noticed people stopping her in the general store or at the diner, asking questions about the Sustainable Agriculture Center, offering suggestions or expressing support. Not everyone was convinced. Richard's development still had strong backers, but the dialogue had become more nuanced, less polarized. Work on the barn continued, with Miles and Eleanor falling back into their comfortable rhythm of physical labor. But something had changed between them too, a new awareness that remained largely unacknowledged, but was present in every shared glance, every brush of hands as they passed tools back and forth, every moment of silence that stretched a beat longer than necessary. Noah, oblivious to the undercurrents, had fully embraced farm life. He collected eggs each morning, helped Eleanor water her vegetable garden, and had even started a journal documenting the various insects and animals he encountered during his explorations. Mrs. Jameson, who had taken a shine to him since the night of the town meeting, had begun teaching him to bake, a skill Noah approached with his characteristic enthusiasm, if not natural talent. One afternoon, as Miles was replacing rotted wood on the barn's west wall, he caught sight of Noah and Eleanor in the orchard. They were planting something. New trees, Miles realized, remembering Eleanor's mention of her last conversation with William. Noah was digging small holes while Eleanor carefully positioned young saplings, their heads bent together in concentration, occasional laughter drifting across the yard. The scene struck Miles with unexpected force. It was so domestic, so natural, the kind of moment that would have been commonplace in another life, the one he and Karen had planned together. But instead of the familiar pain that usually accompanied such thoughts, Miles felt something different. A quiet recognition that life could hold new patterns, new connections, without diminishing what had come before. Later that evening, as Miles was finishing up his work for the day, Jim Halloran's truck pulled into the driveway. The older man nodded a greeting as he climbed out, his weathered face serious. "Got a minute?" Jim asked, gesturing for Miles to join him away from the barn, where Noah and Eleanor were still engaged in their planting project. "Sure," Miles replied, setting down his tools and following Jim to the shade of a large oak tree. "Something wrong with the cabin?" Jim shook his head. "Cabin's fine, it's not about that." He hesitated, then continued. "Heard from Frank at the hardware store that you might be headed to Claiborne soon. Got a job lined up there." Miles nodded, surprised. That his plans had become a topic of local conversation, though he supposed he shouldn't be. Small towns had their own information networks. "Well, I wanted to talk to you before you made any final decisions," Jim said. "I don't normally get involved in other folks' business, but this seems important." "What does?" Miles asked, genuinely puzzled. Jim gestured toward the barn, the farm, the valley beyond. "This place, Eleanor, what's happening here?" Miles started to protest, but Jim held up a hand. "Hear me out. I've known Eleanor Hayes since she was born. Watched her grow up, watched her marry William, watched her struggle after he died. She's as strong a woman as I've ever known, but these last few years have been hard on her. Fighting Westbrook alone, managing the farm, carrying all that history on her shoulders." Miles waited, sensing Jim had more to say. "Then you and your boy showed up," Jim continued, "and something changed. It wasn't just about fixing that old barn. You brought something back to this place, some kind of life, some kind of hope." He looked directly at Miles. "I don't know what's between you two, and it's not my business, but I do know that sometimes life gives us second chances, and only a fool walks away from them without at least considering what they might mean." Miles found himself at a loss for words, caught off guard by Jim's directness, and the uncanny way he had zeroed in on the very questions Miles had been wrestling with. "I'm not trying to tell you what to do," Jim added, his tone softening. "Just suggesting that before you pack up and head to Claiborne, you make sure you're going for the right reasons. Not just because it's what you've always done, or because staying is scary." With that, Jim nodded once more and returned to his truck, leaving Miles standing under the oak tree, his thoughts in turmoil. The older man's words had struck uncomfortably, close to home, challenging the narrative Miles had been telling himself about why they needed to move on. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the Hayes farm, Miles watched as Noah and Eleanor finished their planting for the day. His son's face was smudged with dirt, his expression radiant with accomplishment. Eleanor was showing him how to water the newly planted trees, her hands gentle as she demonstrated the proper technique. They looked like they belonged together, like a family. The thought both terrified and attracted Miles in equal measure. "Come on, Dad," Noah called, spotting him across the yard. "Come see the apple trees we planted. Miss Eleanor says they'll start bearing fruit in a few years, and we can make apple pie and apple cider and everything." A few years. The time frame hung in the air like a question, a possibility Miles had been refusing to consider. What would it mean to be here in a few years, to watch those saplings grow, to harvest the fruit they would eventually bear? The week following the town meeting brought unexpected challenges to the Hayes farm. A sudden thunderstorm rolled through Oakridge Valley, drenching the land in sheets of pounding rain and whipping the trees with gusts of wind that bent even the sturdiest oaks. Miles had been working on the barn's northwest corner when the first drops fell, and he'd barely made it inside before the skies truly opened. Eleanor joined him, rushing in from the garden where she'd been harvesting late summer vegetables. Her hair was plastered to her face, her clothes sodden, but she was laughing, a full, unrestrained sound that echoed through the cavernous space of the barn. "That came out of nowhere," she exclaimed, pushing wet strands of hair from her eyes. "The forecast said clear skies all day." Miles smiled, handing her a relatively clean rag from his tool belt. Weather forecasters and fortune tellers, equally reliable professions. Their easy banter was interrupted by a deafening crack of thunder, followed almost immediately by a sound that made both of them freeze. The splintering of wood, the tearing of metal, the unmistakable destruction of something substantial. They rushed to the barn door, peering out into the downpour. One of the ancient oaks that had stood sentinel at the edge of the property had been struck by lightning. The massive trunk had split, half of it crashing down onto the fence that separated Eleanor's eastern fields from the neighboring property, the very property where Richard Westbrook had already begun preliminary work for his development. "That's not good," Miles muttered, assessing the damage from the doorway. The fence was completely destroyed for at least 30 yards, and the fallen tree created a natural bridge between the two properties. Eleanor's expression tightened. "No, it's... especially since that fence marks the legal boundary. With it down." She didn't need to finish the thought. The physical barrier between her land and Westbrook's ambitions had literally been flattened. "We can fix it," Miles assured her. "As soon as this storm passes, I'll get started." Eleanor nodded, but there was worry in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "It's not just the fence. That oak was over 200 years old. It was here before my family, before Oakridge itself. Seeing it destroyed like this..." Miles understood. The tree wasn't just a tree. It was a symbol, a living connection to the history Eleanor was fighting to preserve. Its loss felt like an omen, a physical manifestation of the threats facing the Hayes land. They watched the storm in silence for a few minutes more, both lost in their own thoughts. Miles found himself wondering what Karen would have thought of this place, of Eleanor, of the unexpected turn their lives had taken. Would she have understood his hesitation to stay, or would she, with her characteristic directness, have told him to stop running and recognize what was right in front of him? "We should check on Noah," Eleanor said finally, breaking into his thoughts. "He was helping Mrs. Jameson with a new bread recipe when I last saw him." Miles nodded, concerned about his son despite knowing he was safely inside. They made a dash through the rain toward the main house, arriving breathless and even more thoroughly soaked. Inside, they found Noah and Mrs. Jameson in the kitchen, completely absorbed in their baking project and blissfully unaware of the tree's demise. "Dad! Ms. Eleanor! We're making sourdough!" Noah announced proudly, his hands covered in flour, a smudge of it across his nose. "Mrs. Jameson says I'm a natural." Mrs. Jameson, a tiny woman with snow-white hair and the energy of someone half her age, nodded in agreement. "The boy has good instincts, knows when the dough feels right." She squinted at their drenched appearance. "You two look like you went swimming with your clothes on." Eleanor laughed, the worry temporarily leaving her face. "Close enough. There's a bit of storm damage we need to deal with, but it can wait until the rain stops." "Storm damage?" Noah asked, his curiosity piqued. Miles ruffled his son's hair, adding more flour to the mess. "One of the big oaks came down, took out some fencing, nothing we can't handle." Noah's eyes widened. "Can I help fix it? I'm getting really good at hammering nails. Mrs. Jameson said so when I helped fix her garden trellis." "Did she now?" Miles glanced at the elderly woman, who winked at him over Noah's head. "The boy's a quick study," Mrs. Jameson confirmed. "Got a good eye for detail too, not like most youngsters these days, always rushing." The pride in Noah's expression at this praise made Miles's chest tighten. His son was flourishing here, finding mentors and friends, developing skills and confidence that their nomadic lifestyle had never quite allowed. The thought of uprooting him again, of saying goodbye to Mrs. Jameson and Eleanor and the farm that had become his playground and classroom, seemed increasingly cruel. By the time the storm passed, leaving behind a washed-clean sky of startling blue, Miles had made a decision. He wouldn't tell Noah about the job in Claiborne yet, not until he was certain about what path they should take. For now, they would focus on repairing the storm damage and finishing the barn. The future could wait a little longer. The fallen oak presented more challenges than Miles had initially anticipated. Its massive trunk and sprawling branches created a barrier that would take considerable effort to clear before the fence could even be addressed. After surveying the damage more thoroughly, he called Jim Halloran, who arrived within the hour with a chainsaw and a grim expression. "That's quite a mess," Jim observed, assessing the splintered remains of the ancient tree. "Going to take more than just the two of us to clear this." As if in answer to his concern, a pickup truck pulled into the driveway, followed by another, and then a third. Miles recognized several faces from the town meeting, men and women who had spoken in support of Eleanor's vision for the farm. They came with tools, with work gloves, with determined expressions. "Heard about the oak on the community bulletin board," explained Frank from the hardware store. "Figured you could use some extra hands." Eleanor stood on the porch, visibly moved by the unexpected show of support. "I can't ask all of you to give up your day for this." Martha Deacon, the beauty salon owner who had initially supported Richard's development, stepped forward. "You didn't ask. We offered. Besides, this isn't just about clearing a tree. It's about showing where this community stands." Miles caught Eleanor's eye, sharing a moment of recognition. The town meeting had done more than just present competing visions for Oakridge's future. It had reminded people of their connection to this land, to its history, to each other. The fallen oak had become a rallying point, a tangible way for residents to declare their allegiance to Eleanor's cause. The work was grueling, but proceeded with surprising efficiency, given the number of willing hands. Jim supervised the chainsaw operation, cutting the massive trunk into manageable sections that others carried away. Some of the wood would be used for repairs around the farm. The rest would be seasoned for firewood or milled into lumber. Nothing would be wasted, a philosophy that seemed perfectly aligned with Eleanor's vision for the farm's future. Noah darted among the workers, carrying water, delivering messages, and generally making himself useful in the way of children determined to be part of adult activities. Miles kept a watchful eye on him, but allowed him the freedom to contribute. In his own way, By mid-afternoon, they had cleared enough of the tree to begin work on the fence. Frank had brought extra fencing materials from the hardware store, refusing payment when Eleanor tried to reimburse him. "Consider it an investment in Oakridge's future," he said with a wink. As they worked, conversation flowed easily among the volunteers, touching on town gossip, weather predictions, and inevitably Richard Westbrook's development plans. Miles was surprised by how many had been swayed by Eleanor's alternative proposal. "My son's studying sustainable agriculture at the State University," Martha confided to Eleanor as they worked side by side, stretching wire between new fence posts. "When I told him about your idea for a research center, he got so excited, said he'd come back to Oakridge in a heartbeat if there was that kind of opportunity here." Similar stories emerged throughout the afternoon of children and grandchildren who might return to Oakridge if there were meaningful opportunities that didn't require paving over the valley's natural beauty. The Sustainable Agriculture Center wasn't just an abstract concept. It represented a possible future many residents hadn't previously considered. As the new fence began to take shape, Miles noticed a black SUV parked on the road beyond the property line. Richard Westbrook stood beside it, watching the community effort with an unreadable expression. After a few minutes of observation, he got back into his vehicle and drove away, but his brief presence had been noted by several of the volunteers. "Doesn't look too happy, does he?" Jim remarked to Miles as they secured a particularly sturdy fence post. "Probably thought that fallen tree was a sign in his favor." Miles nodded, driving the post deeper with a few well-placed hammer blows. Instead, it brought people together against him. Jim's weathered face creased in a smile. "Funny how things work out sometimes." By sunset, the fence had been rebuilt, stronger and more secure than before. The volunteers gathered in Eleanor's yard for a simple meal of sandwiches and lemonade, tired but satisfied with their day's work. There was a sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose, that reminded Miles of barn raisings he had read about but never experienced. Communities coming together not just to build a structure, but to affirm their connection to one another. As the last of the volunteers departed with promises to return if needed, Eleanor stood beside Miles on the porch, watching the golden light fade from the valley. Noah had finally succumbed to exhaustion and was sprawled on the living room sofa, dead to the world despite the earlier noise of conversation and laughter. "I never expected this," Eleanor said softly. "All these people giving up their Saturday to help fix a fence." "It's not just about the fence," Miles replied, echoing Martha's earlier words. "It's about taking a stand." Eleanor nodded, her gaze distant. "For years, I've felt so alone in this fight, like I was the only one who cared about preserving the land, about keeping something of the old Oakridge alive." She turned to him, her expression open and vulnerable in a way he had rarely seen. "Thank you for that, for helping people see there's another way forward." Miles shook his head. "I didn't do anything. You're the one who stood up at that town meeting, who offered an alternative that made sense to people." "But I might not have had the courage without you there," Eleanor insisted. "Knowing someone believed in what I was fighting for, it made a difference." The simple honesty of her words touched something deep in Miles, a place he had kept carefully guarded since Karen's death. He had spent 3 years avoiding entanglement, avoiding the vulnerability that came with caring too deeply about any person or place. Yet here he was, irrevocably entangled in Eleanor Hayes' fight, in her vision for the farm, in her life. "I should get Noah home," he said finally, the word home catching in his throat. The cottage wasn't home, not really. Neither was the Halloran cabin or any of the temporary dwellings they had occupied over the past 3 years. Home was a concept Miles had deliberately kept at arm's length. Eleanor seemed to hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Of course, he's had a big day." She hesitated, then added, "Miles, About the job in Claiborne. I haven't decided yet, he interrupted, not ready to have this conversation. The barn still needs work. That's my priority right now. Eleanor studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, one day at a time. Miles carried the sleeping Noah back to the cottage, the boy's weight a familiar comfort in his arms. As he tucked his son into the loft bed, Noah stirred briefly, mumbling something about trees and fences, before drifting back into deep slumber. Miles watched him for a moment, struck by how peacefully he rested, how at home he seemed in this place that was supposed to be just another temporary stop. The next morning brought clear skies and an unexpected visitor. Miles was in the barn, early, determined to make progress on the remaining repairs, when the sound of a car door slamming drew his attention. Looking out, he saw Richard Westbrook approaching, dressed more casually than usual in khakis and a polo shirt, but still managing to look out of place among the farm's working machinery and weathered structures. "Mr. Parker," Richard called, spotting Miles in the barn doorway. "I was hoping to catch you alone." Miles set down the hammer he'd been using, mentally preparing himself for whatever this conversation might bring. "Mr. Westbrook, what can I do for you?" Richard glanced around, confirming they were indeed alone before continuing. "I'll be direct. I've been watching your work here and I'm impressed. A man with your skills could do very well in a growing community." "Meaning?" Miles asked, though he suspected where this was heading. "Meaning Westbrook Development could use someone like you," Richard replied smoothly. "Once Oakridge Crossings breaks ground, we'll need a skilled construction supervisor, someone who understands quality work, who can manage a crew effectively." Miles didn't bother hiding his surprise. "You're offering me a job?" Richard smiled, clearly pleased to have caught him off guard. "I'm suggesting a mutually beneficial arrangement. You'd have stable employment, not just for a few weeks or months, but for years, the kind of security a single father might appreciate." The offer was calculated to hit its mark, and Miles couldn't deny its appeal. Steady work in one location, a decent salary, the chance to put down roots without financial worry. These were things he had struggled to provide for Noah since Karen's death. "And all I have to do is—" Miles prompted, certain there was more to this proposition. Richard's smile never faltered. "Help me reason with Eleanor. She respects you, listens to you. Make her see that fighting this development is a battle, that she'd be better off accepting my offer while it's still generous." So there it was. Not a job offer, but a bribe, an attempt to turn him against Eleanor. Miles felt a flash of anger, both at the assumption that he could be bought and at the transparent manipulation of his concern for Noah's welfare. "I appreciate the offer," Miles said carefully, "but I don't think I'd be a good fit for Westbrook Development." Richard's expression hardened slightly. "Are you sure about that? I did some checking after the town meeting. Your contracting business in Portland was quite successful before your wife's accident. You have skills, experience. Why waste them on odd jobs and temporary repairs when you could rebuild a career?" The mention of Karen and his former business caught Miles off guard. Richard had done his homework, had found the vulnerabilities he thought might be exploited. It was a calculated move, exactly the kind of tactic Miles would expect from a businessman used to getting his way. "My arrangement with Ms. Hayes is about fixing a barn, not influencing her business decisions," Miles replied, keeping his tone professional despite his growing irritation. Richard studied him for a moment, reassessing. "I see. Perhaps I misunderstood the nature of your arrangement." The slight pause imbued the last word with insinuation, suggesting he believed there was more between Miles and Eleanor than a professional relationship. Before Miles could respond, Noah's voice called from outside. "Dad, Dad, come quick, the baby goats are being born." Richard's eyebrows rose. "Sounds like your son has become quite attached to farm life." Miles didn't respond to the observation, instead calling back to Noah. "Be right there, buddy." Turning back to Richard, he kept his expression neutral. "If there's nothing else, I should get back to work." Richard nodded, conceding this round, but making it clear the larger battle was far from over. "Think about what I said, Parker. Security, stability, a real future. That's what I'm offering. Not just to you, but to your boy." He glanced in, the direction Noah's voice had come from. "Children need roots, don't they? A place to call home." With that parting shot, calculated to dig into Miles's deepest concerns, Richard returned to his car. Miles watched him drive away, troubled not just by the job offer, but by how accurately Richard had identified his vulnerabilities. Security, stability, a home for Noah, these were exactly the things Miles had been unable to provide since Karen's death, the things he had told himself were less important than staying in motion, staying safe from further loss. Miles found Noah in the small pen behind the barn where Eleanor kept 2 nanny goats. One was indeed in labor, with Eleanor kneeling beside her, offering calm reassurance as the animal brought new life into the world. Noah watched with wide-eyed fascination, all his attention focused on the miracle unfolding before him. "Is she okay?" he whispered as Miles approached. "She sounds like she's hurting." Eleanor glanced up, offering a reassuring smile to both Noah and Miles. "She's doing exactly what her body was made to do. It's hard work, but she's strong." As they watched, the first kid emerged, tiny, wet, and seemingly miraculous. Within moments, the nanny goat was cleaning her newborn with gentle, thorough licks, helping it breathe and preparing it to stand on wobbly legs for the first time. "That's amazing," Noah breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "She already knows exactly what to do, and the baby does too." Eleanor nodded. "Nature is pretty incredible that way. There's wisdom in these animals, passed down through generations." Miles watched his son's face, saw the pure amazement there, the connection to something primal and important that their transient lifestyle had rarely allowed. Noah was witnessing the cycle of life firsthand, was learning lessons no classroom or picture book could adequately convey. A second kid arrived shortly after the first, the birth easier and quicker. Soon both newborns were nursing, their tiny tails wiggling with contentment. Noah couldn't contain his excitement, asking Eleanor dozens of questions about goats, about babies, about farming and life and death. She answered each with patience and honesty, treating his curiosity with respect rather than condescension. Watching them together, Miles felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Richard Westbrook's job offer, meant to be tempting, had instead crystallized something important. The choice before him wasn't really about security versus risk or stability versus movement. It was about what kind of life he wanted for Noah, what kind of man he wanted his son to become. Here, on this farm, with this remarkable woman who fought for what she believed in, who nurtured both land and people with equal care, Noah was growing in ways Miles hadn't anticipated. He was learning about responsibility, about connection to place, about standing up for what matters even when it's difficult. Could Miles really take him away from this? Could he go back to their nomadic existence, to the emotional distance they had maintained from every place and person they encountered? And even if he could, was that truly what was best for either of them? As the afternoon wore on, the question expanded beyond Noah to include Miles himself. What did he want? What kind of life was he choosing by constantly choosing to leave? Eleanor caught his thoughtful expression as they left the goat pen, Noah running ahead to tell Mrs. Jameson about the new babies. "Everything all right?" she asked. "You seem preoccupied." Miles hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Richard Westbrook paid me a visit this morning, offered me a job with his development company." Eleanor's step faltered slightly, though she quickly recovered. "I see, that's quite an opportunity." "It was a bribe," Miles clarified. "He wants me to convince you to sell." Relief flickered across Eleanor's face, followed by a flash of anger. That man doesn't miss a trick, does he? First he tries to turn the town against me, and when that fails, he goes after the people She caught herself, amending whatever she had been about to say. The people helping me. Miles noticed the correction, but didn't press it. I told him I wasn't interested. Eleanor studied him for a moment. Because you don't want to pressure me, or because you genuinely believe my plan for the farm is better? And for Oakridge, it was a fair question, one that deserved a thoughtful answer. Both, Miles said finally. What you're proposing makes sense for this land, for this community, and even if it didn't, I wouldn't betray your trust for a paycheck. The vulnerability in Eleanor's expression made Miles realize how rarely she allowed herself to be truly seen. For years, she had shouldered the burden of the Hayes legacy alone, had fought Richard Westbrook's development plans without allies, had maintained the farm through sheer determination and grit. Trusting someone else, even partially, represented a risk she wasn't accustomed to taking. Thank you, she said simply. That means more than I can say. The morning Miles finished the barn was quiet, almost ceremonial. He drove the final nail with deliberate care, aware of the significance beyond the simple act of completion. The structure stood renewed, strong, purposeful, ready for decades more service. Not unlike himself, Miles thought with unexpected clarity. Eleanor appeared beside him, 2 steaming mugs in hand. So that's it, she said softly. The barn is fixed. Miles accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing in a moment of connection that sent warmth through him, unrelated to the hot beverage. Not just fixed, he corrected, restored, ready for whatever comes next. They stood in companionable silence, surveying their handiwork. The barn had transformed during these weeks of labor. Rotted wood replaced, roof reinforced, foundation strengthened. What had begun as a simple repair job had become something more meaningful, a reclamation, a renewal, a promise kept. Miles, Eleanor began, her voice hesitant in a way he rarely heard. The job in Claiborne. A car door slammed, interrupting whatever she'd been about to say. Richard Westbrook strode toward them, flanked by 2 men in suits carrying briefcases. His expression was triumphant, almost predatory. "Eleanor," he called, "I think you'll want to hear what my attorneys have to say." Miles instinctively moved closer to Eleanor, a silent statement of support as Richard approached. "I'm not interested in more pressure tactics," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. Richard's smile didn't waver. "This isn't a tactic. It's a reality you need to face." He gestured to one of the suited men, who opened his briefcase and extracted a document. "We've secured initial county approval for the rezoning of adjacent properties. More importantly, we've discovered a surveying error from 1978. Eleanor's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" "Your eastern boundary. The survey your father commissioned after purchasing the Robertson tract was flawed. According to the original land grants, the boundary actually cuts through what you've always considered Hayes property, including the site you've proposed for your agricultural center." Miles watched Eleanor's face pale. "That's impossible. My family has owned that land for generations." "Not according to these historical records," Richard countered, handing her several official-looking pages. "The county surveyor has verified our findings. I'm not here to take what's yours, Eleanor. I'm here to clarify what was never yours to begin with." The calculated cruelty of this approach, undermining not just Eleanor's current position but her family's legacy, made Miles's jaw tighten. "Convenient timing," he observed, "finding this error just when you need that particular piece of land." Richard's gaze shifted to Miles, dismissive. "Historical facts don't change based on timing, Mr. Parker. They simply wait to be discovered." Eleanor studied the documents, her hands trembling slightly. "I'll need my lawyer to review these." "Of course," Richard agreed smoothly, "but the county surveyor's endorsement makes this fairly straightforward. I'm still willing to purchase your remaining property at the originally offered price." A generous gesture, considering this development. Miles watched emotions war across Eleanor's face, shock, disbelief, and beneath it all, a devastating uncertainty he had never seen in her before. This was different from Richard's previous tactics. This struck at the very foundation of her identity as caretaker of the Hayes legacy. "I'll give you some time to process this," Richard said, his tone almost sympathetic. "Call me when you're ready to discuss terms." With a nod to his attorneys, he returned to his car, leaving Eleanor standing with the papers clutched in her hands, looking more vulnerable than Miles had ever seen her. "Eleanor," Miles began, but she shook her head, eyes still fixed on the documents. "I need to think," she said quietly. "I need to understand what this means." She walked away, heading toward the house with steps that seemed weighted, as if the very ground beneath her feet had become uncertain. Miles watched her go, feeling helpless, in a way that reminded him painfully of Karen's accident, confronted with a situation he couldn't fix, couldn't control, couldn't make right through hard work or determination. Later that evening, after a day spent giving Eleanor the space she clearly needed, Miles found himself on the cottage porch with Noah, watching fireflies rise from the fields like earthbound stars. His son's innocent question cut straight to the heart of his dilemma. "Are we still leaving, Dad, now that the barn is finished?" Miles looked at his son's upturned face, illuminated in the soft twilight. "Would it be okay with you if we didn't?" Noah's eyes widened. "You mean stay here forever?" "Maybe not forever," Miles hedged, still cautious despite the decision forming in his heart. "But for a while longer at least." Noah's face broke into a radiant smile. "Yes, I could help with the baby goats and finish learning to fish and maybe plant my own garden." His enthusiasm faltered slightly. "But what about your job in Claiborne?" "Some things are more important than jobs," Miles said simply. The next morning, Miles left Noah happily helping Mrs. Jameson with her garden and walked to the main house. He found Eleanor at the kitchen table, surrounded by old maps and legal documents, her face showing signs of a sleepless night. "I've been researching all night," she said without preamble. "The boundary issue isn't as clear-cut as Richard made it seem. There are competing surveys, historical claims that contradict each other." Miles sat across from her. "So there's hope?" "There's a fight," Eleanor corrected. "A complicated legal battle that could take years, and resources I don't have." The defeat in her voice spurred Miles to reach across the table, covering her hand with his. "You're not alone in this, Eleanor. Not anymore." She looked up, searching his face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Noah and I aren't going to Claiborne. I'm saying we want to stay if you'll have us." Eleanor's breath caught. "Miles, you can't make this decision based on my problems with Richard." "This isn't about Richard," Miles interrupted gently. "It's about us, about Noah, who's flourishing here in a way I've never seen before, about me, finally ready to stop running from loss and start building something new." He tightened his grip on her hand. "About you, if you want that too." The first genuine smile since Richard's visit appeared on Eleanor's face. "I do want that," she said softly. "More than I've let myself admit." The battle for the Hayes farm wasn't over. There would be lawyers and surveys and community meetings ahead. But as Miles leaned across the table to kiss Eleanor, sealing a promise that had been building since that first day in the barn, he knew they would face it together. This land, this woman, this life, worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth loving without reservation. And in the end, wasn't that what building a home was really about? Up next, You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check. Them out!